Why, hello there, Jacob. And today, ladies and gentlemen, as you can clearly see, I have some Minnesota Wild garb on. So, what does that mean, ladies and gentlemen? Well, first and foremost, it's actually cool enough out that I can start wearing these things again without, overheating. But also, that means preseason training camp is underway. Hockey's back, baby. So, I figured with the season coming up and, a lot of transition and a lot of interesting points coming up with this team, why not give my general thoughts and opinions on the early Minnesota Wild season? So, without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right into it. But first, just a little channel update and channel news and stuff like that. I do have a few pickups coming in the mail over these next several days or so, including one of the new Fanatics Premium jerseys, so stay tuned for that. I may or may not also have a couple of Minnesota Wild related items, including a potential Grail item. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Stay tuned for that over these next several days or so. And also, too, don't forget, Minnesota Vikings updates will be coming up soon within the next couple of days as we take on the Green Bay Packers in round 1 of the border battle between the Vikings and Green Bay at not-so-frozen Lambeau Field. So yeah, stay tuned for all of that. And with all that being said, let's go ahead and get into the video. But yeah, as I mentioned before, the Minnesota Wild are at a very, very interesting spot in their team's, future, really. Because a lot of the older guard are starting to kind of get weaned out, and a lot of the youth are starting to develop to a point where they're becoming massive contributors. So early on, I'd say in the months of October and November, I'll be looking to see how Bill Guerin and John Hines basically start the season. Which lines are going to be out there, how much youth is going to be out there, how many veterans are going to be out there, who gets called up, injured, this, that, the other thing, and who knows, there might even be a few trades thrown in there too, looking at Philip Gustafsson. So let's kind of talk about that here, because one of the biggest points is Jesper Wallstedt. While that might not be necessarily the key point, that is definitely one of the biggest points this season is how much time does Jesper Wallstedt get in Minnesota? Well, the Iowa Wild just recently acquired a new goaltender from, I believe, Binghamton, or Belleville. So my guess is more times than not, Wallstedt is going to be up with Fleury and maybe Gustafsson. The reason why I say maybe Gustafsson is because depending on how the beginning of the season goes in the goaltending net, Fleury's probably just going to be, riding into the sunset here with the Minnesota Wild, unless he decides to, go back to Pittsburgh or, a contending team for one last run. But for the most part, I have a feeling it's going to be Fleury and Wallstedt will probably be the two goaltenders that end the year, unless Gustafsson goes out there and absolutely kills him. So yeah, or one thing that I could also see happening, at least, amongst the Minnesota Wild brass and media that I've been hearing about, is they could potentially trade Gustafsson. Which honestly would make a lot of sense, especially if he's actually doing well. Because, there's going to be, a goaltending hungry team like a Vancouver maybe. Edmonton always seems to be looking for goaltenders. Maybe even Boston at this point. I don't even know what's going on with the whole Jeremy Swayman issue, but let's just say it's not good. So there could be a lot of suitors over these next couple of months or so that could really use a Philip Gustafsson. Or with that said, they could even hold on to all three and then let Fleury ride off into the sunset, then have a tandem of Volstead and Gustafsson. But again, I'm not Bill Guerin. I'll have to, watch and see that decision as it progresses. Now, with that out of the way, how are the lines going to work? Because obviously it's probably going to start off, the top line being Zuccarello and Kaprizov, with, I want to say it'll either be Rossi or Ek, probably Ek on the top line. And then that second line is probably going to be Johansson, Rossi, and, well, probably, maybe Boldy? It just depends because, of course, in typical Minnesota fashion, Matt Boldy is week to week with an injury. And then the bottom two lines are going to be interesting. I know it's going to probably be some combination of Foligno, Husnadinov, maybe Ogren, Trenin, and a few other guys thrown in there too. But I'll be curious to see because those third and fourth lines could be the blender lines. Like if we want to get some of our youth up here, depending on the young guys that do come up here. So don't be surprised if there's a lot of line shuffling and a lot of line changing over these first couple of months while we try to get the team together that we want to see, pushing forward into like the Christmas break, going into the Four Nations tournament and trade deadline era. But for now, I just want to see what the young guys do, like during the preseason. Sort of the guys that are going to be the call-ups, sort of the guys that are going to be down in Iowa, down in Coralville, which players are going to be where and who's going to be, the future faces here. Like an Ogren. Ogren's probably going to be the big one to watch. He's probably next up to be like in full train. Yurov is going to be another interesting name to keep an eye on. Because depending on how he does over, I believe he still has 1 year left in the KHL. He might come over by the end of the year, kind of like what Husnadinov did. So, who knows? I mean, this is going to be a very intriguing season because the future of the Wild is, well, a potential massive one here. Because think about it. Kaprizov is going into his final season next year. And if the team isn't quite up to snuff here, who knows? If it's just the same shuffling, if it's the same this, that, or the other thing, I would not be surprised if he bolts to like New York or places like that. Now, again, I don't want that to happen. He's a very intricate piece of this team, and if he goes out, if he gets traded or whatever the case might be, this could be interesting. Plus, Bill Guerin and John Hynes. Yeah, especially Bill Guerin. Granted, I will give him probably another year or two unless this thing completely derails because, let's be honest here, now we're at that point where do we trust Bill Guerin to be the GM pushing forward here? Because in the past, he has a history of really head-scratching contract extensions with a lot of players that remind him of him. Problem is, this isn't like 1999 hockey. This is 2024 hockey, which is a more speed, which is a more skill, which is a more, it's not so much bump and grind up and down the ice for 60 minutes. Granted, it is nice to have that lunch pail mentality. Don't get me wrong, You do want to have a little physicality and stuff like that, a little snarl to you. But that's not the entire thing, basically. And there could be a potential world where if this thing falls apart and Hynes isn't the guy, that Guerin goes with him and we get a completely fresh front office going into 25-26 or 26-27, just kind of depending on, again, how everything turns out. But yeah, the early part of this season is going to be a very interesting one. And, yeah, like I say, the Wild do have another preseason game tomorrow night against Dallas. They did go up to Winnipeg and beat them 5-2. But I unfortunately couldn't really watch anything or didn't find a stream and, was kind of watching football and stuff like that. But from what I've been hearing and seeing and stuff like that, yeah, I mean, it's a pretty solid start. And, yeah, I mean, honestly, these first 8 to 12 weeks or so are going to be very, very intriguing because there is so much on the line this year and so much looking at the future at stake here. Because again, massive transition point. I've only probably hammered that home 1,000 times. I'll hammer it home 1,000 more times because again, after the buyouts end and we can start building the squad and start building a contender here, do we trust the front office? Do we trust everybody? Or should we start over for the new era? And also the Kirill Kaprizov potential contract extension coming up too. Be kind of interesting to see how things work there, how Kirill feels throughout this season, and how a lot of our other star players feel throughout this season. But, yeah, no, I think that'll pretty much wrap it up for the initial thoughts and opinions there. I'll probably make one more video once preseason gets towards the end and I can actually watch a little bit more of it and stuff like that. But, again, this season, I wouldn't expect a whole lot as far as, like a playoff or, stuff like that. But I'd also expect the Wild to be in it more off for, a lot longer than they're out of it. We'll just leave it at that here. Because even though the Wild were absolute buns.com last year, at least in a lot of stats, injuries with an older team and stuff like that, a physical team, that's bound to happen. But, yeah, again, we'll just kind of wait and see here because this is going to be a very big year. So, now that I've blabbered on long enough, again, stay tuned because I do have a lot of pickups coming in the woodworks, as I mentioned earlier, including a few jerseys, maybe a hat, and some various stuff coming. And, yeah. So, until we meet again, this is Jacob. Have a good day.